Hello and welcome to the Deep Dive Perspective, a show in which we showcase essentially countercultural, counter-political narratives from voices that are often discarded, ignored and censored by mainstream legacy media. Today's topic is something I think is very relevant, not just to Britain, because that's where most of our story will play out in the conversation that I'm going to have, but across the world. The reality is that there are fundamental economic, political and other policies which seem, a no-brainer to be implemented. Yet, time and time, we see governments often influenced by neoliberalism and the ethos of neoliberalism, which go against the kind of policies that would really help the people. Of those kind of phenomena, I would say Corbinism in Britain is one of the most, most outstanding examples to study and to understand, because what happened to Jeremy Corbyn and Corbinism really impacted where Britain went, and it is still impacting Britain and how it's being run, with Keir Starmer and his entourage now delivering what they were threatening to, I guess, all along. But people had him down as a saviour. Is he a saviour? Are the policies which Keir Starmer is rolling out any different from the people who came before? How does it relate to what Jeremy Corbyn was proposing? And would Corbinism have done a better job than what we seem to be getting from the current range of governments that we've ushered in? With me in the studio to share that experience of that period of Corbinism particularly is Chris Williamson. And we're going to use his book, 10 Years Hard Labour, as a perhaps platform to explore what really could have been done and what should have been done back in the Corbyn years, as I call them. But Chris, first of all, give us an overview of what actually happened, because there's still a lot of mystery about what went on. There was the entire anti-Semitic, if you like, mantra, which seemed to swarm over the Labour Party and particularly attacked Jeremy Corbyn. But what happened out of that, what actually went on, the backstory, most people still don't know. So give us a little overview of that time first.
Sure, yeah. Well, it was a massive opportunity, a wasted opportunity, in my opinion. I think we had a real chance, once in a lifetime, probably longer than that, in fact, probably once in a millennia opportunity to really transform the country and bring about a kind of common sense socialist alternative for the British people. And there were a lot of forces that were ranged against us, and you could see there was a massive appetite for an alternative to the neoliberal status quo that had held sway really since Dennis Healey went to the International Monetary Fund on a false premise in 1976 on the notion that somehow Britain could run out of money, which is an absolute absurdity given that it issues its own currency, isn't subject to the gold standard, and Bretton Woods agreement, which linked the pound to the dollar, was abandoned by Richard Nixon in 1971. And so, what we've seen is, privatisation, globalisation, jobs, manufacturing jobs, secure jobs that working class communities used to sort of take for granted, being offshored to low wage economies. A lot of people think, people fell out of love with the trade union movement. Now, of course, Thatcher brought in lots of, anti-trade union legislation, and that certainly didn't help. But the biggest reason why trade unions, the membership of the trade unions, diminished so substantially was because those jobs had sort of offshored to countries where labour was very, very cheap. So people were looking for a real alternative, and Corbyn offered that, I think. And look, we've never seen the sorts of crowds that Jeremy Corbyn attracted to public meetings. People used to say, the age of public meetings are dead, but it used to be, attracting thousands of people, bringing city centres to a standstill. For example, when he went to speak in Liverpool, it was like Beatlemania all over again. Amazing scenes. Not just in this country either. I mean, I was being invited after I'd lost my seat temporarily in 2015 by a very narrow margin, and was getting invites to go and speak in Europe. I mean, at first, when I got the first invitation, I thought it was a joke, but it wasn't. So people were looking at what we'd done what we'd achieved with Jeremy Corbyn, not just in this country, but really right across Europe. And so I think there was a massive wasted opportunity. Where it all fell apart was, I think, in predominantly the anti-Semitism scam. whereby the Zionist lobby didn't want the leader of an opposition with a potentiality of becoming the prime minister, who was pro-Palestine, very critical of the apartheid state of Israel. And they teamed up, with the globalists, with the right-wingers. And so Jeremy was sabotaged, from day one. But he made it easy for them because he constantly apologised and kept trying to appease. And his priority was to keep the parliamentary Labour Party together and to try and win over the unplacatable Zionist lobby. And what he should have done, excuse me, and when he did come out swinging, for example, when he was accused of being a misogynist and when he was accused of being a Czech spy, absurd accusations, just as the accusation that he was somehow an anti-Semite or facilitating anti-Semitism were absurd. But because he constantly sought to appease and apologise, that gave them strength. And so whilst in the end, Labour floundered in the 2019 election over Brexit, Jeremy's political capital was destroyed by the Zionist lobby and his attempt to try to placate them. And so his political capital had been massively diminished and he'd lost influence. And he didn't actually seize the opportunity of bringing about a fundamental democratic reform inside the party. I was leading a campaign, we called it the Democracy Roadshow, going around the country. Jeremy had invoked this democracy review of the Labour Party. Hadn't included within that, though, the notion of open selections, mandatory reselection for MPs.
Sure.
Now, if you think about it, in every other country that I've ever seen, including the United States of America, where the president has to go through an endorsement process before they can stand for a second term. But in Britain, in the Labour Party, once you're elected, then that's it. There is no real method of holding you to account. And so I was leading a campaign to require MPs, Labour MPs, to go through an endorsement process before each election. And Jeremy, at the 2018 conference, asked Len McCluskey, who was the General Secretary of the Unite Trade Union, who carried a big block vote, to vote against it. Now, had he supported open selections, the votes at the Labour Party conference are split 50-50 between 50% go to constituency Labour Party delegates and 50% go to the trade unions and so-called socialist societies. And it was 90-odd% of the constituency delegates were in favour of open selections. And virtually all of the trade union delegations, apart from the Fire Brigade Union, opposed it. And had Len McCluskey used his block vote, that was the Unite's policy as well, actually. They'd voted for open selections in their 2016 conference. That would have gone through. And that was done, apparently, so according to Len McCluskey, at the behest of Jeremy Corbyn. And this other mistake, fundamental mistake, where he signed his own death warrant and signed the death warrant for the Corbyn movement in that month of September 2018, was when he also went along with the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism. And now he lost a vote at the Labour Party's National Executive Committee meeting. But in my opinion, what Jeremy should have done is come out of that meeting saying, I've lost the vote at the meeting today. However, I'm the leader of the party. I think the National Executive Committee is wrong, and I'm therefore going to take this issue to the floor of the Labour Party conference later this month. Had he done that, I'm sure he would have carried the day. The IHRA working definition would have never been adopted. Had he also got behind the open selections, the Parliamentary Labour Party that was seeking to sabotage him, the right wing of the Parliamentary Labour Party, if you remember, there was a vote of no confidence in Jeremy, with the vast majority of them voted to remove Jeremy in 2016. They were on the ropes. They knew that their days were numbered. Many of them would have lost their seat because members would have removed them, and the rest of them would have known that they would have had the sword of Damocles hanging over their heads, so that they would have had to abide by party policy. And it's not just about agreeing with what the party members wanted. The policies that Jeremy Corbyn was advocating were overwhelmingly popular with the vast majority of the British people as well.
By doing it, would he have broken the party? Do you think? Because you said that was his fear.
No, he wouldn't have. Well, he may have broken the Parliamentary Labour Party, but that would have been a good thing, because those people are not fit for purpose. They serve the interests of global elites in this, in Britain, and indeed, obviously, around the world. Hence the term global elites. They serve the interests of global corporations and the Zionist lobby. And, their duty should be to serve the interests of the British people. That's what they're elected for. And they're actually supporting policies which run counter to the interest of the British people. Look, we've got 14.5 million people living in poverty in Britain. That's an outrage in a country that is supposed to be the 6th biggest economy in the world. Now, in a country that that worked in the interests of the people, that wouldn't happen. We would eradicate poverty. I mean, I was arguing that Jeremy, and I used to argue in the Socialist Campaign Group of Labour MPs that we should be pushing the leadership to go further, because whilst the programme was good, it wasn't good enough, in my opinion.
The economic side, I think, particularly.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, Jeremy's commitment, for example, to eradicate street homelessness was a very laudable ambition, but it didn't go far enough. Of course, that's a minimum that you would expect. I mean, we are the 6th biggest economy in the world. Nobody should be sleeping on the street, but nobody should be living in poverty. And I just wanted us to kind of go back to the 1974 Labour Party manifesto commitment, which committed the Labour government of Harold Wilson to bring about an irreversible shift in the balance of wealth and power in favour of working people and their families. And they were on course to do that until Dennis Healey, after Harold Wilson stepped down and Jim Callaghan became the leader of the party. I know this is ancient history, but it kind of sets the scene of where we are now. Went off to the International Monetary Fund for a loan which was never needed and never drawn down. And in exchange for that, of course, the IMF, as they always do, insisted on austerity measures, which led directly to the so-called winter of discontent, trade union dispute, etc., which was a cause célèbre at the time and was used against the Labour government to suggest that Britain wasn't working, etc. All those infamous posters that Saatchi were retained by the Conservative Party at the time, and that led directly to where we are today. And so I think a historic opportunity was lost for Britain and for the world, because I think had we got over the line here in Britain, this would have had a knock-on effect right across Europe and potentially further afield. What
are the kind of things that you'd have seen happening if those policies had gone through, just to give us an idea of what kind of Britain you think would have emerged?
Well, the first step, of course, would have been we would have seen the utilities brought back into public ownership. We would have seen a situation where selling gas and electricity wouldn't be used to generate huge profits. So people's energy bills would have been considerably lower. Similarly, with water, for example, vast majority of people want to see that. We would have seen a big investment in public housing in this country. We would have seen a big investment in public services, really, across the piece. We would have seen the removal of the private sector from fundamental public services like the National Health Service, much of which has already been privatised, and so therefore the overarching priority for these health companies, which are, they've got the NHS badge outside, but their overarching priority, their fiduciary duty indeed, is to make a profit. Now, public services, particularly health, shouldn't be about generating profits. You should be providing public services. So those would have been the initial changes which I think we would have seen brought about. But I wanted to see us going substantially further, and in relation to the economy and the fact that, as I've already mentioned, that we issue our own currency. Literally, money is no object for the government. We can always find the money. That's not the problem. The issue is, has it got the real resources in the economy? And so long as you're matching investment to real resources in the economy, there are no inflationary pressures. And that's an area where I would have liked to have seen, the government, if we'd have got over the line, moving in that direction. But unfortunately, even with that, what was a relatively radical in present, situation, present circumstances over the last sort of 50 years. But it wasn't, in my opinion, radical enough. And John McDonnell was still boxed in by neoliberal orthodoxy. I mean, he embraced this thing called the fiscal credibility rule, an absurdity, which kind of limited the ability of the government to manoeuvre, and was talking about reducing the deficit year on year. Well, the deficit doesn't really matter. I mean, it's a ridiculous notion that somehow the deficit is an issue.
But then it sounds like political and economic illiteracy, if that's the only word I can probably think of it now, is partly to blame, because largely the public did vote against those policies, knowing what they were. But the causes of that are probably many. You've hinted at a few. The relationship between the Labour bureaucracy, for instance, with corporate power,
Yeah.
The internal relationship of the trades unions, perhaps with corporate power as well, was something that in your book you say you underestimated at that time. You didn't realise quite how embedded they all were. Is that still what you believe? Is that one of the major reasons?
It's even worse now. I mean, I don't understand why any self-respecting trade union leader is still throwing money at the Labour Party when they are working against the interests of working people in this country.
How does that relationship work? How are they tied together?
Well, a number of trade unions are affiliated to the Labour Party, and even those that aren't look to the Labour Party as their kind of natural spokesperson in the political sphere in that sense. And the reality is they're not actually speaking up for working class people in this country. They're not speaking out for trade unions in this country. I mean, if they were doing that, then we would see the sort of policies that Jeremy Corbyn was advocating. As I say, they're not that radical. What Jeremy was talking about is not that radical. It's the sort of policies that I grew up with in the 1960s and 70s. And indeed, when I was growing up in the 60s and 70s, I was being told, as all my contemporaries were, of course, that to get ready for the leisure generation. Because we were being told by the 1990s, early 2000s, we'll only be working 15 hours a week. So local authorities were being urged, you've got to build leisure centres and golf courses and tennis courts and swimming pools for people, because they'll have a lot of spare time. We need to be investing in adult education so people can, we could grow as human beings, grow as communities. And there was an opportunity, to do that. Look, go back even further than that. In 1930, John Maynard Keynes, that great economist, talked about his grandchildren's generation, my generation, would only be working 15 hours a week, and that's the sort of notion that expectation was current, as I say.
Well, when I was the neoliberal corporations are now pushing towards that kind of scenario, even now, because AI is on the scene. So
yeah, but like the Luddites said. The Luddites get a bad rap. The Luddites were not against new technology, but they were saying technology should be our servant, not our master. And there were all these skilled artisans that were just thrown on the scrap heap back then. No little wonder they went around sabotaging the new modern looms that the mechanisation of their trade, as it were, because they were just thrown into penury. And so what we were saying is that new technology should, like the Luddites were saying, and I used to be arguing as I used to going around on the Democracy Roadshow, that we should become 21st century Luddites and demand that new technology should serve us, as John Maynard Keynes was talking about, and new technologies come, but we haven't benefited from it. I mean, people are working longer hours than they've ever done. I mean, and then of course you've got people who are of course underemployed and unemployed. But with the right mindset, we could have a good society. We could have the world-class infrastructure, world-class public services. As I've said, no poverty. We would be able to retire at a reasonable age if we wanted to. All these things, not like pie in the sky. It's not like something which is an impossible dream.
Two or three statistics come to mind with how government has spent money. The quantum easing, maybe anything up to £400 billion. The COVID scenario, something like 800 billion, I think. The forever wars in West Asia, about 80 billion. These are eye-watering figures.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
But I mean, people can't really get their heads around them. And yet when we talk about the NHS or investing in infrastructure, suddenly there's no money. And there was austerity going on prior to all this kind of spending as well. So something's not quite right. But I'm going to go back to that question about the relationship of neoliberal corporate interests and politicians and the role of media. Because part of what happened with Corbinism was also very clear that people like Nick Robinson, you spoke about in your book, who pushed this mantra. I think it was a Radio 4 program, I think, where you appeared with him, and he was trying to pin you with the anti-Semitism stuff and insisting that you were or Labour Party was anti-Semitic. So there's that factor that on the one hand you've got these trades unions, you've got perhaps even the fear amongst the hierarchy of the parliamentarians or the Parliamentary Labour Party, at least, that you were talking about. Then you've got this media fraternity, which seemed to be baying for blood and went along with this anti-Semitic sort of narrative in a massive way. Does that mean that's the kind of thing that happens when you come up with policies that don't suit the hierarchical, elites, that they trigger any number of ways of destroying anything that you're going to try and do. Is that something the public should be aware of? And how do you prevent that within the system?
Well, I mean, it's certainly something the public should be aware of. I think they are increasingly aware of it, but not enough. It has been used in the past. I mean, we saw the attempts to bring down Harold Wilson's government. We saw what happened when Michael Foot was the leader of the Labour Party, and we saw it on steroids in what they did to Jeremy Corbyn. But as I say, in spite of all the attacks on Jeremy, the 2017 election saw the biggest increase in vote share for the Labour Party since 1945, came within a hair's breadth of actually being able to form a government, in fact. And it shows you, I think, when you put forward a really positive message like that, with the sort of mass movement that Jeremy had engendered, then even with those sustained attacks from the corporate media, from the establishment, from even within the party, that you can still make progress, as it were. But I think what we needed to do after the 2017 election, I mean, Jeremy enjoyed a honeymoon period for a time, and I think that was a time to consolidate. And unfortunately, he missed that opportunity. I don't know if you remember when he went to the big festival, the big pop festival. People were singing his name, and it was unheard of. 100,000 youngsters chanting Jeremy's name in the. I think it was in the July or June, whenever that big pop festival takes place. I've forgotten the name of it actually now, but anyway, yeah. I should remember it, but it's the biggest pop festival on.
It's Glastonbury.
Glastonbury, that's the one. Yeah, the Glastonbury, the Glastonbury festival. Yeah, but unfortunately, Jeremy didn't sort of take that opportunity. I was saying to Jeremy, "Look, this is the best result we could have hoped for, because had we won a majority with the Parliamentary Labour Party that we've got, they'd have sabotaged the programme and engineered a way of pushing you out, or certainly stopping the progressive policies that were in the manifesto from going forward." That's why the democracy reforms were so crucial, and that was the opportunity really to take that fight to the Parliamentary Labour Party that were seeking to oppose him and undermine him, and also to take on the Zionist lobby as well.
All right. I was going to come to this now, because I wanted to rewind you to say you raised the issue of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism and the kind of campaign, the concerted campaign that went on, which you really were the fundamental target of ultimately. Jeremy was, of course, publicly, they went after him in terms of saying that he hosted the H groups and also other visits that he had done, and they basically smeared him with a connection. Then you had the same kind of treatment, if not worse. You speak of even other clashes with people like Len McCluskey and having a direct confrontation. He initiated just because of the criticisms that you were, or the arguments that you were putting forward for your the change of the political structure or whatever. They didn't seem to like that. But it seems to me that there has to be an extraordinary amount of power and control, because the Tories were exposed for collaborating with Israel and Israel lobbies, and taking money as well, in fact, for pushing their agendas. And it strikes me as though Jeremy Corbyn and what you guys were saying, one of the fundamental things was an anti-imperialist, anti-war set of policies, which would have very much gone against Israel's interests, and certainly gone against maybe even America's interests, because they wanted war.
Well, Mike Pompeo said they wouldn't allow Corbyn to become Prime Minister, so yes, clearly.
So this business of foreign interference is rather worrying. In a democracy where we're supposed to have control over our own country, are there any checks and balances now? I mean, what you saw and what did you see? How did that all pan out, the influence? And was there, do you think there was foreign government influence?
There's no doubt in my mind about that. I mean, look, when you think about it, nearly half of the Parliamentary Labour Party were members of the so-called Labour Friends of Israel. I mean, they were taking their instructions directly. We saw, I mentioned Mike Pompeo saying that they wouldn't tolerate Corbyn becoming the Prime Minister. Benjamin Netanyahu made similar remarks about it as well. There was clearly interference in the democratic process in this country from Israel, because they were determined to prevent someone who, as I say, was sympathetic to the Palestinian cause and critical of Israel, and they couldn't tolerate that, and therefore did everything in their power to stop him from getting into government. And that's why he needed to be ruthless against these characters and actually call out the anti-Semitism scam for what it was. And it was clearly a scam. I mean, before they targeted me, they went for other high-profile people like Ken Livingstone, who, in my opinion, has done more to advance the cause of anti-racism of someone in public office when he was the leader of the Greater London Council, particularly, but also when he became the mayor of London. Indeed, he earned the sobriquet as a loony lefty, in part because of his stance on anti-racism. Yet here he was being demonised as some sort of a racist and Nazi apologist, according to John Mann. But there were other people as well, people like Jackie Walker, a prominent Jewish vice chair of the Momentum group that was established to support the Corbyn movement. Regrettably, in the end, the leader of that, John Landsman, turns out to have been a Zionist. I don't know if he was a sleeper or what, but I mean, he's an out-and-out Zionist. And so, we were being undermined from not just within the Labour Party bureaucracy itself, but also even from Momentum. So there were people like Jackie and indeed Tony Greenstein, whose father was a rabbi, who was the first Jewish member of the party to be expelled on the grounds of bringing it into disrepute because of his anti-Semitic outbursts, none of which were anti-Semitic, of course. Jeremy should have been speaking out for these people and calling it out and saying, look, this is clearly a manufactured smear campaign, because they're even going after Jewish people and accusing them of being anti-Semitic.
Why didn't Jeremy respond more robustly?
Well, I mean, I think he was badly advised by the people around him. Some of them, I believe, were Zionist sympathies. Others took a view that it was better to try to appease their opponents. People like John McDonnell, for example, kept saying, well, we just do this one thing, it'll draw a line under it. I don't know how many lines he drew under things, but it never worked. I mean, when I was suspended, for example, with John McDonnell, and then reinstated after 4 months, I think it was, and then there was a move to have the whip withdrawn, signed by 150 MPs and peers. And John contacted me to say, what you need to do is apologise again and again, and offer to see any MP who's been hurt, offended or distressed by what you said, and make the same offer to the National Executive Committee of the Labour Party, and go and see the Board of Deputies of British Jews and the Jewish Leadership Council. I made the point that, John, I'm not going to do any of those things. Apart from it being the wrong thing to do, politically it doesn't work. I mean, I've no way I'm apologising. I've done nothing to apologise for. The Labour Party owes me an apology. I said to him, therefore, what you need to do, John, is issue a statement welcoming my return to the party and go on to the media this weekend and defend it. But he didn't do that. And then within, 12 hours or so after John had that conversation with me, I was only reinstated for 48 hours. Jenny Formby, who was the General Secretary of the Labour Party, who was brought in to replace a right-winger, Ian McNicol, who turned out to be more of a witch hunter than even McNicol, because she exacerbated the whole anti-Semitism scam and witch hunt against people who were being targeted, all of whom were Jeremy Corbyn's Praetorian Guard. Not just the high-profile individuals, but all of the activists that were being thrown under the bus were all Jeremy's key supporters.
Well, you talk a lot about betrayal in your book, and I will come on to that in a little while, just the kind of betrayal that you were talking about. But you also spoke about organisations. I was thinking about foreign organisations like state actors that were influencing British foreign policy, British policy, and the Al Jazeera documentary clearly evidenced that there is such a thing. It's not some sort of conspiracy theory, but there are British-based organisations which were very, very heavily involved in this, and some of them that I dug up. The campaign against anti-Semitism, the Community Security Trust, the British Israeli Communications Centre,
BICOM,
the Board of British, I think the Deputies
Yeah, Board of
themselves.
Board of Deputies of the British Jews, yeah.
Yeah, they were also involved. That's a lot of organisations with a strong Zionist connection, who are British citizens, but were out in force for essentially a witch hunt, lynching Jeremy Corbyn and purging the Labour Party of the supposed anti-Semitism. What do you think of those organisations now? How much influence do they still have in being able to steer government in a direction which they want?
They have huge influence. Alan Duncan, the former Foreign Office Minister, Tory Foreign Office Minister, said that basically the British Foreign Office is, I'm paraphrasing now, but word to the effect, is basically run from Israel. And that certainly, we've got the Prime Minister now, who in his leadership campaign to become the leader of the Labour Party said that he supported Zionism without qualification. I've already mentioned that many Labour MPs are members of the so-called Labour Friends of Israel. Many of them actually receive funding. A large proportion of the cabinet have received funding from Zionist, prominent Zionist individuals, people like Trevor Chin, who also bankrolled Sir Keir Starmer's leadership campaign for the Labour Party. So they are hugely influential over the Labour
Let me
Party.
compare something, because clearly people can end up accusing you of anti-Semitism the minute you start on a mantra about Israel and about this Zionist fraternity, because they read Zionism and Israel as Jewishness. So immediately they conflate the anti-Semitic kind of tropes as being part of your narrative, and that's what you really mean. And somehow that manages to have a massive influence, I can see, because there's a lot of self-censorship, there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of failure to speak out when even genocides are happening before our very eyes. So you can see that there's still a palpable control that people exercise on themselves without even being legally having to do it, although that happens too. But I'm kind of wondering, just to balance it up, say the government of Russia or the Orthodox Christian Russians or whatever their denomination is, say they were to have a comparable influence in Parliament, do you think they would have the same, would the media deal with them in the same way?
Well, there'd be an outcry, wouldn't there? There would be an outcry. But look, the Zionists have been very effective in their operations in terms of their influence that they wield over, not just in Britain, but in the United States and in Europe and in all the Western world, really, Australia as well. They're very, very influential, and they're very deeply embedded in the political sphere, in the media and industry and all the rest of it. So they do wield enormous influence, and this conflation between opposition to criticism of Zionism and Israel with anti-Semitism. I mean, it's a trick that Shlomo Aloni, a former prominent Israeli minister in the government 20 odd years ago, interviewed in a program for Democracy Now, I think it was called, American program. And she was asked about this, and she said, well, it's a trick. We always use it. Anti-Semitism and Holocaust, whenever criticism of Israel, is to the fore, then this is the thing that they use to divert people and to shift the discussion, as it were.
Well, David Miller's exploits within the legal system here have been very much around challenging that kind of conflation and how it works out in terms of people's lives, because people have been stopped from working in the medical field for this.
Professor David Miller being a case in point, but he's not the only one. I mean, a number of people in the medical field. I mean, it's happening all the time. I mean, when I defeated the Labour Party in the High Court over their resuspension of me in the summer of 2019, and won that and got cost, and we established the Left Legal Fighting Fund, and we've used that to defend a number of people against these bogus allegations. And so the thing about the Zionist lobby is they have this maximalist strategy, and it's not just about winning a political battle. They want to utterly destroy people. So they kind of win the political argument, they want to lose their career. I mean, they've taken David's academic career from me, but they've taken doctors out, they've taken legal professionals out, various people, teachers, many people have lost their employment as a consequence of that. That's why Professor David Miller's case, which he took to the Employment Tribunal after he was sacked unfairly by the University of Bristol on the grounds that he was in some way, promoting anti-Semitism, even though he'd been cleared by two QC, as it was, then it'd be now a KC, but two QC-led inquiries into these allegations which had been made against him, fomented by the Union of Jewish Students, which is a Zionist outfit, as are all those other organisations that you listed previously. The allegations that were made against him were initially dismissed because they were made by somebody who wasn't even at the university. And then they found somebody who was a student at the university, a member of the Union of Jewish Students, but wasn't one of David's students. So they'd never had any interaction with him. And they made a complaint about him. They didn't feel safe on campus, and he was an anti-Semite, he was this, he was that. Two, as I've said, QC-led inquiries, both of whom completely exonerated him, said absolutely no evidence whatsoever of any anti-Semitism at all. And after the second independent inquiry had concluded, the university still sacked him, saying that David Miller didn't reach standards expected by the University of Bristol. And he took them to an employment tribunal and won the case, and actually established the principle that opposition to Zionism is a protected characteristic in employment law. Now, the University of Bristol's appealing that decision, and it's going to an employment appeal tribunal, and we're hopeful and expectant even that David will win there. And if he does, then that will become absolute case law, which will have to then be followed. So it's a really crucially important case, because this will protect many, many other people who are being silenced, really, by the Zionist lobby from speaking out. And then there are others as well who impose this sort of self-censorship that you referred to. And the Jeremy Corbyn supporters inside the Parliamentary Labour Party when I was an MP very much fall into that category. The entirety of the so-called Socialist Campaign Group all ran away. There's a line in the Labour Party anthem, which is no longer applicable to the Labour Party, if it ever was, but it certainly isn't applicable now, called The Red Flag. And there's a line in it where it says, while cowards flinch and traitors sneer, we'll keep the red flag flying here. Parliamentary Labour Party is entirely made up of cowards and traitors. And I include in that the Socialist Campaign Group, because all of them ran the other way. And there's a wonderful poem by Pastor Niemöller, who was a victim of the Nazis in Germany in the 1930s, called First They Came. First they came for the communists, and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the socialists, and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me. Well, what's happened? What happened to Jeremy? I mean, Jeremy's now suffered the same fate that I did, and other people in the Socialist Campaign Group have subsequently suffered the same fate. And there's nobody left to speak out for them. And yet people like John McDonnell is still pleading to receive Sir Keir Starmer's whip. Wants to just get back to normal, he said. I mean, I don't know, these people are cooked.
Well, the fear factor is certainly there. I mean, I'm going to come back to something we didn't fully cover, was that unholy trinity of politicians, bankers, corporates, interests, and media. I mean, I know, for instance, the Barclay brothers, for instance, they are corporate magnates here within the media. Rupert Murdoch is huge. In the old days, people like Maxwell was well known, and others as well. That media does seem to have a lot of synchronicity, shall we say, with all these kinds of narratives and mantras, and they can build up or destroy politicians, and that, it seems, increasingly is what much of the media gets used to, the mainstream legacy media gets used to. What do you think about the role of media today in politics? I mean, is there something that should be done to be able to manage their level of power as well?
Well, it should be, so most certainly, yes. But it's not as influential as it used to be. But there's nothing new about this. I mean, they've always done that. I mean, as I mentioned, you know, they demonised people like Harold Wilson, Tony Benn, Michael Foot, and others. So this is nothing new. They haven't got as much power as they used to have, however, because there is the advent of social media and independent platforms, dare I say, platforms like yours, where an alternative narrative is able to be heard. They are still incredibly influential, but it is a disgrace because they do seek to manipulate the political system, democracy in this country, and they serve the interests of a very small elite proportion of the community. I mean, it's ironic, isn't it, that the media moguls that you mentioned. I mean, these people, predominantly, tax exiled billionaires who have no real kind of interest in what is going to improve the life or not of ordinary working people in this country. I mean, if they were, then as I said, we wouldn't have the levels of poverty and low pay and deprivation, etc. I mean, what a disgrace that, we're going to see now this winter, thousands of pensioners have probably lost their lives as a result of the Labour Party scrapping the winter fuel payment. And the Labour Party, for God's sake, I mean, this is supposed to be the party that speaks up for ordinary people, but they're exacerbating poverty in this country and, is continuing to support Israel in the teeth of overwhelming public opposition to support for Israel. The Prime Minister making excuses for them, refusing to call what is clearly a genocide that was taking place in Gaza, refusing to acknowledge that, continuing to sell arms to them, but continuing to give diplomatic and political cover. I mean, this is an absolute disgrace.
So the solutions, coming on to solutions, you're now the deputy leader of the Workers' Party.
Yes.
And when you critique what went on, and then remember also the fact that Jeremy Corbyn had some very solid ideas for how Britain could be brought back to life economically and otherwise. Are you carrying out a lot of those policies now within your manifestos, number one? And the other thing is really to say the reaction to the Workers' Party, I noticed in the last election, was very different from the ones of the Reform Party. Both parties newly emerging, yet the number of times I saw George Galloway or the Workers' Party on any mainstream media is probably almost zero in the context of being a political party fighting for election. Whereas compare that to Reform, even now, and more so than even the election, I seem to see the media creating Mr. Farage as the darling of a British future almost, and he's then not coincidentally, also rising in the rather not uncoincidentally rising in the ratings to the point where he's leading now, basically.
Yes.
So this relationship of media with, say, your views, the kind of solutions that you've got, it doesn't seem to have changed. They're not giving you any traction.
No, indeed, and that's in large measure because the Workers' Party were ghosted. George didn't get the coverage as the leader of the party that was fielding far more candidates than the Plaid Cymru or the Scottish National Party. There was a leaders' debate on TV, at least one, maybe more. And yet George didn't feature. We hardly got any coverage at all. But it's interesting that when George Galloway won the by-election in Rochdale in February last year, there was almost a state of emergency declared by Rishi Sunak. If you remember, he came out onto the doorstep of 10 Downing Street to denounce the electors essentially of Rochdale for electing this individual. And then the election was called in the summer, which, if I'm honest, did catch us unawares. We were expecting the election to come a bit later. I think had it been a bit later, the Workers' Party, which is a new party, would have been in a better position, and we may have got some of our people over the line. But the reason I think that the media give the likes of Nigel Farage an easy time is because they are not threatening the status quo. I mean, they might give the appearance of being the people's champion and speaking out for working class people, but they are absolutely not doing that. In reality, their policies are even more extremely right wing than the Conservatives under Margaret Thatcher were. I mean, they admire Margaret Thatcher. They want tax cuts for the billionaires, and they want a flat rate tax, similar to the kind of poll tax, which was so controversial, where the Duke and the Dustman would be paying the same amount of their local.
But isn't it worrying that, looking across the pond at Donald Trump, he has the same kind of policy narratives that Farage has, or Farage has the same or similar ones to his, and he was successful. He's in power now and causing a lot of what people would describe as chaos. Many people. Farage is the same. Are these kinds of? There's a sort of hint I get that there's almost silent forces that we've been talking about already, having the ability to be able to bring in whoever they want into power, and then puppeteering them into doing exactly what they want. Is that really what we're getting, or is that kind of down?
I think there's definitely an element of more than an element of truth in that. As I've said, Reform is sort of positioning itself as the kind of anti-establishment champion of the people, when in reality, it's more it's continuation of neoliberal warmongering, essentially. There are areas where we would agree, however, with reform. There are areas where we would agree with Donald Trump. I mean, the fact that he's looking to bring an end to the war in Ukraine is a good thing. The fact that he's taking on the globalists is a good thing. In fact, if
appointing RFK to the health,
well, that's an interesting move as well, isn't it? Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, there are certain, look, I mean, I think we should. I think our mantra is, look, where we agree, let's agree. And let's celebrate the fact that if they're going to get something right, then we'll acknowledge that. We'll be critical where we think they're wrong, but where we think they're getting it right, well, we'll acknowledge that. I mean, just because Donald Trump, for example, is associated with ending a war in Ukraine, we shouldn't then automatically as a knee-jerk response say, oh, we can't support that. And,
well, the thing that worries me, the shift to the right generally of politics in Europe, is being engineered largely with the narrative of immigrants and immigration.
Yes, of course. Well, the other people,
and both Trump and Farage are pushing that narrative. Yeah. It's an extraordinarily powerful narrative because it's a genuine fear of the people. But can in the Workers' Party or the left that you represent, can you make an equally powerful one policy or two policy narrative which could rival that and actually persuade people?
Well, I think we can, and obviously we have to rely on the alternative media platforms and social media. Although even on that, with the algorithmically being sort of suppressed, as it were. But I think when you get the opportunity to put the sort of arguments that we are advocating in front of people, it is extraordinarily popular. In fact. I experienced this when I was standing in the last election. Unfortunately, didn't get over the line. But a lot of people in working class communities that I spoke to, and we didn't have enough people actually do the door knocking, sadly. But when we did get those chances to talk to people who were thinking about voting reform, and then I was able to explain what our policies were. People were very attracted by that. Now, I don't know whether or not they ended up voting for us. So I think the sort of policy agenda that we are putting forward is one that. Given a chance, is popular. We saw this with Jeremy Corbyn and the Giles Brandreth clip, which I often refer to, where he was looking for secret socialists in the capital of the home counties, in Guildford, and stopping people on the street doing a fox pop. And people overwhelmingly were supporting, kicking the privateers out of the NHS, bringing the utilities back into public ownership, and so on. And I think in regards to this fear about immigration, in some ways, that's a legitimate fear in terms of the impact it has on public services, how it might lower wages and things like that for people, because clearly, vulnerable people exploited by, the ruling classes, as it were. I always say to people on the doorstep when they start to complain about asylum seekers and migrants, is to say, well, you've got more in common with the migrants and the asylum seekers that you're complaining about than you have with the people at the top of society. You need to lift your eyes above the horizon. But our position, and link arms with those people, because, there's more that unites us in that sense. But in relation to this concern about migration, what the likes of Reform, Labour are now doing it as well, they're focusing on the symptoms. And what we're saying is, let's address the cause. Why are desperate people seeking refuge and asylum here in the first place? It's because of war. It's because of arms sales. It's because of sanctions, which are impoverishing, populations. Let's stop the wars. Let's stop the imperialist wars. Let's stop the arms sales to despotic regimes. Let's stop the sanctions, which are impoverishing these populations, and let's look at how we can collaborate and work together and help those countries in developing their economies. In a way, like China does. China's foreign policy, yes, of course, they want something in return when they go into countries, but they go into countries and they build infrastructure, bridges and so on, and provide resources for people. Yes, they want something in return, but it's a kind of an equal and respectful relationship, an equal, respectful partnership. That's the sort of approach I think that we should be embracing, and that's the sort of thing we're talking about. And I think that sort of notion, if you actually speak to people and say, look, let's stop if you're concerned about immigration, let's stop it. Let's stop the problem at source. Because why would you leave the home that you've grown up? If you say to somebody on the doorstep, why would you leave somewhere that that you're familiar with, or all your support networks are something that you're familiar with? You've got to be pretty desperate to do that, haven't you? Just think about it. So let's stop the reason why people are seeking that, and that's what we're saying. So we're talking about a sustainable long-term solution rather than this ridiculous stop the boats mantra is all we ever hear from the likes of Farage and company.
I've not checked the statistics lately, but the last time I did check, emigration always outweighs immigration. So people are worried about all these people coming in, taking jobs usually which are hotel jobs or the lowest paid, the night worker's job, the job which is the one that the indigenous and the native community doesn't want. Basically, that's always been the case with immigrants arriving. They've done the dirty work in a way.
They have, but it's all down to kind of low pay, and it's easier to exploit people who are vulnerable.
But the emphasis and the racial element comes into this, that emigration tends to be white.
Absolutely.
And the immigration, the one they focus on is the brown one, although the actual immigration still bears out that East Europeans have been also a large number. So there does seem to be a racial undertone.
There definitely is everything. Absolutely there is. And this is something that the likes of Reform and so on play on. It's easy to single somebody out who's got a different colour skin and so on. It's interesting, isn't it? Of course, I mean, this came into sharp relief, didn't it? Only very, very recently when... excuse me, the leader of the Conservatives at Prime Minister's Question Time tackled the Prime Minister about the Palestinian family who'd sought refuge here using the same rules that have been put in place to facilitate migration from Ukraine. And he would say, well, that's a loophole that we have to close. Clearly, it couldn't be more nakedly racist, could it? And this is a Labour Prime Minister that is indulging in that sort of xenophobia. So it is something that we need to be vigilant about. But I think with the right and given the opportunity to put these arguments to people, I mean, I think the arguments that we're putting forward as a Workers' Party, I think people are receptive to it, in my opinion.
Well, in conclusion, I mean, I think we've had a great insight, actually. There's some really fascinating insights into what happened and why they're relevant today. And so just in conclusion, do you think those policies that you were fighting for then under Corbinism are just as relevant and can be just as cogent and necessarily beneficial for the British public today? And what are the main ones, just so people know?
They're even more relevant than they were then. We have in a country which is incredibly wealthy, one of the biggest economies in the world. As I've already mentioned, 14.5 million people living in poverty. Our economy is struggling. We've got a government which is talking nonsense about the only way in which to grow the economy is to bring in private investment. Well, that ain't working, and that won't work. And the way in which to grow the economy is through a big fiscal stimulus, to invest in our public services, to improve our public services, to bring our utilities back into public ownership, to invest in our infrastructure. That in turn would actually start then to bring in the private sector investment, because they would want a piece of that action, as it were. And so I think those sort of policies, when people look at them, they are still popular. We know this from public opinion polls. People are desperate for a change, are desperate for the sorts of policies that we're advocating. Our challenge is getting our message in front of people and people recognising that there is an alternative out there that is actually speaking to the sorts of priorities that they hold dear to their hearts. So that's what we'll be focusing on, and hopefully through platforms like yours and other independent media platforms, we'll be able to get our message out and grow our party and start to have those conversations face to face on the doorstep as well.
Well, let me mimic what Piers Morgan would probably say, and most of the legacy Zionist loving media. I'd say, Chris, are you anti-Semitic? Perhaps I should put that just to satisfy the audience out there. Are you anti-Semitic?
Yeah, well, this is an absurdity. Look, and I've spent my life fighting racism in all its forms, and indeed I mention this in the book. I mean, as a young apprentice bricklayer in the 1970s, when casual racism was a real thing, I nearly got beaten up on more than a few occasions, and was very active in the Anti-Nazi League, confronting genuine racists. And the reality is that the Zionists are the racists. There's no more virulent form of racism in the world today than Zionism. It's a genocidal ideology that absolutely has to be exposed, resisted and defeated. And that's what I will absolutely
Well,
committed to do.
of course, we all know that they're just doing self-defense, and Chris is just completely off track there. But he's definitely not an anti-Semite. I don't think so. So to my Jewish brethren and all my Zionist media fraternity, we're not necessarily anti-Semitic. We just want the right to be able to ask the right questions and to get to the truth. You'll be welcome on this platform. In fact, I'm looking forward to welcome anybody from the Jewish Board of Deputies or any of the organisations we mentioned. We will give you equal amount of time to come and discuss your fears, your concerns and your influence on British society. Let's talk about it. Happy to accommodate you. There is no bias here. This was a one-to-one interview, and of course, all the opinions that are there are very, very openly in the public. But yeah, deep dive perspective. We've gone on a deep dive into all sorts of issues there. Do give us your feedback. Remember to comment and do make suggestions for how we can perhaps tackle more issues like this. But also for us, in our favour, we'd like you to subscribe, like, and of course share this programme so that we can get more people doing the deep dive. Thank you for watching.